Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. Throughout the history of this podcast, we've done legacy episodes about several great bands and artists. However, when it comes to legend, mystique, vast musical influence, and quite honestly, historical importance, none of those artists we've discussed, no matter how much we love them, come close to the mighty Led Zeppelin. Rising from the ashes of the Yardbirds and the unknown Band of Joy from Birmingham, England, Zeppelin shot to massive worldwide commercial success with a speed no band had ever experienced before. More importantly, they built on the heavy, psychedelic rock innovations of Cream and Jimi Hendrix to create a new kind of rock, pumping up the blues with steroids, as Gene Simmons once famously said, setting the template for heavy metal with a sound heavier than anything that came before and heavier than most of what came after. But the beauty, and yes, I stress the word beauty, that lay in Led Zeppelin's music was in the fact that they were more, much more, than a bombastic, heavy blues rock band that bashed you over the head with loud volume and meaty riffs. As their discography unfolded throughout the 1970s, anyone with good ears can hear that the band explored and incorporated elements from various and eclectic musical styles and genres: traditional English folk, Indian classical, funk, R&B and soul, country, reggae, Moroccan music, and in later years, Caribbean music, punk rock, new wave pop, and even disco. It's a testament to their brilliance as both musicians and songwriters that they blended all these influences brilliantly in a rich, texture-filled tapestry that really defined their catalog more than anything else. And then, of course, there's their immense, almost incalculable influence. Heavy metal as we know it wouldn't be possible without them, and their music has been an elemental touchstone influence on at least 5 ensuing generations of bands and artists spanning the subgenres of, as I said before, heavy metal, grunge, alternative, indie, industrial, and beyond. Other non-rock genres have also been touched by the unique genius of Led Zeppelin. Hip-hop, electronica, particularly techno, modern jazz, the 21st century blues-based music emanating from West Africa, and even modern folk music. As the 20th century continues to recede in our rearview mirror, it's pretty apparent that Led Zeppelin rank right up there with the Beatles and the Rolling Stones as being among the all-time great and most influential rock bands. In fact, we're going to attempt to do later in this episode what may seem like blasphemy for some. That is, make an argument that Led Zeppelin may indeed be the greatest rock band of all time. Doing a legacy episode on this band is admittedly a bit daunting. Their weight, or the weight of their legend and legacy, is such that to this day, even the surviving members, Robert Plant in particular, struggle to deal with it. But it's a legacy that is worth discussing. For anyone born after 1960 who calls themselves a rock music fan, Led Zeppelin is practically part of their music-loving DNA. So let's dive into the story of the greatest hard rock band of them all and into one of the greatest musical catalogs of all time as we bring you Led Zeppelin, the legacy of all legacies. And welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report.
Now, Arturo, before we get going here with our Parallel Universe segment, we have to take this occasion to honor Phil Lesh of the Grateful Dead. Lesh is, as many of you may know, listening to this podcast, passed away late last week at the age of 84. He was one of the great bassists in the history of rock and roll, and he really was kind of the soul. If Jerry Garcia was the heart of the Grateful Dead, then in a lot of ways Phil Lesh was the soul, and he was not a very common bassist. The way that he could weave his sounds, he played bass like a jazz man, like a jazz soloist, and not playing bass. And so there was just these tapestries of the things that him and Garcia came up with, especially on the album Blues for Allah. I've always been partial to Lesh's playing on especially the title track. Some really extraordinary stuff. So what's your thoughts about Phil Lesh and what to him stands out? And what do you think his legacy is as a bassist and as a member of the Dead?
He was the classically trained member of the Grateful Dead. Remember, Garcia's background was folk,
bluegrass,
bluegrass and country. Bob Weir was just a rock and roll guy, and but Bill Kreutzmann, the drummer, he was a jazz guy, right? So his background was jazz. Garcia brought the folk and kind of country-ish. Bob Weir was the rock and roll. He was the Chuck Berry fan in the group. Phil Lesh was the classical music guy. That's where he came from. And that's why his bass playing was so unorthodox, because he wasn't really a pop music musician. That wasn't his thing. That's why his bass playing was so weird and so interesting and always stood out when you ever listen to the Grateful Dead, not just on record, but the live stuff as well.
Oh, yeah.
Actually, live is where he really stood out. So that was what Lesh was. He was the classically trained guy in the Grateful Dead, and he was kind of like the you could say he was the one that kind of pinned it all together, because obviously he was the bass player, but he really did because of that. And
he was kind of the spiritual leader. He was kind of the guy that segued and structured the jams.
Yeah,
in a lot of what he did. And American Beauty is another album that has some amazing, Addicts of My Life and stuff like that. Some of that bass playing, and then obviously he wrote the song "A Box of Rain," which is one of the best.
Box of Rain is
one of the best songs in the Dead's entire catalog. So so it's a passing. The 20th century is fading away, and Phil Lesh is a real figurehead of rock and roll. Will definitely be missed, and so we just needed to take this moment to honor Mr. Lesh and the music of the Grateful Dead. So with that, hey Artie, what's that sound?
I don't know. What is it? It sounds weird.
Yeah, it's the aliens coming in from the other side of the space-time continuum, looking to pull us to their side into what we know as the parallel universe, where blue is green and white is black, and everything that's rock and roll is still awesome and still predominates and is still the main thing in the arenas, on the billboards, on the cover of Rolling Stone. There's such a thing. Cities have more than one rock and roll station in them, and they don't just play classic rock. They play more than Bad Company and Nirvana. And so they people still care about rock and roll over in the parallel universe. And so that's a long, fancy way of saying that this is the segment of the show where we cover new and newish albums by artists that we think that you should pay attention to and are doing some really cool things, and that merit just as much enthusiasm as a few of you might have for the Taylor Swifts and the Beyoncés. So, Arturo, that said, who are you covering on this episode's version of the Parallel Universe?
Yes, the recent album by Arooj Aftab, Night Rain. Now, considering that Arooj Aftab won a Grammy Award in 2022 for Best Global Music Performance for the song Mohabbat off her critically acclaimed 2021 album Vulture Prince, putting Aftab in our Parallel Universe segment may be a bit disingenuous. But in keeping with our Parallel Universe motif, in an imaginary world where good music, according to yours truly, Curmudgeons, is properly rewarded, Miss Aftab would be a way bigger star than she is in this world. Born in Saudi Arabia to Pakistani immigrant parents, she spent her teenaged formative years in Lahore, Pakistan, or Lahori, I don't know how to pronounce it. In the
Hmm.
early noughties, access to Western popular music was hard to attain, and there wasn't much infrastructure to support Pakistani indie music. However, that didn't stop Aftab from promoting her music online. And in her late teens, her versions of Pakistani singer Pranay Ranjan's Mera Pyar and Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah went viral and garnered some serious attention for her. She moved to the US in 2005 to attend Boston's Berklee College of Music, where she got degrees in sound engineering and music production. Since 2010, she's lived in New York City, and since then, she's been a major fixture on the city's jazz and quote unquote world music scene. I hate that term. I
Hmm.
really do. But anyway, but she's been a fixture on the scene in New York, scoring films and releasing a series of solo albums that feature her modernist take and twist on traditional Pakistani folk music. Whether she's singing in her native Urdu language or in English, her voice is that of a haunting, spectral beauty that is just intoxicating. My old rock and roll heart is usually a bit resistant to moody, mellow, ethereal music that disappears into an ether of nothingness. But there's a heavy, almost bluesy soulfulness to her voice that always manages to keep her music earthbound. With her latest album that was released earlier this year, Night Rain, rain as in Reign, the album expands on her music palette and ventures further into jazz than ever before, while also being decidedly experimental. Autumn Leaves is an English language cover of an old 1945 jazz pop song by a Hungarian French composer, Joseph Kosma. But you would be forgiven to think it's a modern Aftab composition, as she really makes it her own. A totally unorthodox, unusual percussion sound and jazzy stand up bass guide the track, along with Aftab's beguiling voice as it climaxes with a gorgeous electric piano solo. Bologna takes Aftab's intoxicating Urdu language vocals and contextualizes them in a heavy groove that approximates trip hop, but done by organic instrumentation, acoustic bass, brush drumming, a vibraphone, and an ode, which is basically a Middle Eastern lute. And they all blend into this hypnotic darkness. Last Night, with Reprise in parentheses, takes an English translation of a poem by 13th century Persian poet Rumi and couches it in a subtly intense, jazzy whirlwind of romantic ecstasy that builds in euphoria. Dig the scintillating interplay between acoustic guitar, harp, flute, and Wurlitzer electric piano played by none other than Elvis Costello. My personal favorite track on the album is an Aftab original called Whiskey, where Aftab's studio band push the guitar harp interplay to another level higher, augmented by beautifully sprinkling synthesizer and piano. Night Rain is Arooj Aftab's most romantic record, possibly her most personally revealing record, as well as being her most sonically expansive and daring album. To me, that makes it her best so far, a very solid four-star album. Chris?
Yeah, I'm a little bit less enthusiastic about the record. I do like the song "Whiskey." I think that that's got a good sexuality and sensuality to it that drips. And she presents. I mean, she's got a very strong, a pretty voice. I'll give her
Yeah.
that. She has a very pretty voice. But the rest of the album, I mean, it kind of strikes me as cut rate Sade. And almost like she's going for the Nora Jones thing from almost 25 years ago,
Yeah.
as well. I mean, so you can look at it as that. And so, I don't, I generally don't have the patience for that kind of torch music, to really sit with it and enjoy it, because it's kind of like, once you've heard one torch song, you've heard them all. And so it's my own biases that are kind of getting in the way. But again, it's her voice and her singing and the compelling sounds of Urdu,
Right.
which is a very exotic language, apparently, just from listening to it, that keeps this record from being a complete dud for me, and at least makes it compelling. And like I said, I do like the song "Whiskey." And there's a part of me that wants to spend more time with this album and exploring Miss Offtop and maybe exploring her past catalog, because I think, as you've told me offline, it's more in the reign of Pakistani folk
Yeah.
and sort of more old school Middle Eastern music, and so maybe I would enjoy that a little bit more than this. This is sort of this is a mainstreaming effort, I think. This is almost consciously pop jazz
Yeah.
in some ways, and so it's less inviting than if I had already been familiar with her.
Right.
So you have that on me. You were already familiar with her
Yeah.
coming into this. This is my first foray into Ms. Oftab. I don't know if she's a Mrs. But
No, she's a miss. She's not married.
she's a Miss Oftab.
Yeah.
So I'll have to spend some more time with it. But on the first few listens, mildly compelled. I mean, she's got a good enough voice, and Whiskey is a good enough single that it's not a complete nah for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
So so now we go completely opposite of Arooj Aftab, and we go to one of the wackiest bands on the planet, but also one of the best bands on the planet, a band that we've covered on this podcast a couple of times, and we're talking about Sweden's Goat. Both Arturo and I are big fans of Goat. Arturo's been into them for a long time. I've just kind of caught up to them in the last couple of years. So let's give them some love here with their new album. It's just out a couple weeks ago. It's a self-titled record. So Goat is the name of the album. So let's talk about them a little bit. Goat's long been one of Arturo's favorite bands, and over the past year or so, they've become one of mine too. No one does the spacey psychedelic world music thing. I know you hate that term, but that's kind of
Yeah.
what it captures. No one does the spacey psychedelic world music thing better than Goat does it nowadays. Actually, there really isn't a close second. Goat effortlessly infuses the rhythms of Afrobeat and Latin and Middle Eastern jazz into their brand of jam rock, which makes their albums wholly exciting listens. And they do it with a dollop of mystique, preferring to remain anonymous under exotic voodoo-inspired robes and masks. Seriously, these folks apparently don't even have names. They're a cult of fabricated personality. Yeah, seriously, you look at their bio. Uh, they portray themselves as being part of the Swedish voodoo tradition, which
Hmm.
I didn't realize there was a Swedish voodoo tradition. So there's quite a bit of put on
Yeah.
and a little bit of shtick to their whole ethos. But that's kind of what makes it cool, because then it kind of frees them up to do whatever they want. And they can kind of build their own mythology,
Right.
and they do that extraordinarily well. So anyway,
Yeah.
Goat's newest record is a self-titled affair released earlier in October. The album is endlessly riveting and shape-shifting, serving up one awesome guitar solo and one awesome combination of rhythms after another. Two touch points for this record are Maggot Brain era Funkadelic and Remain in Light era Talking Heads. Those two tastes usually aren't ones that you find being put together, but it works really, really, really well here. The album can basically be seen as two distinct halves. The first half is a barely controlled maelstrom of guitar fire and rump shaking beats. One More Death is lit afire by just a blazing guitar solo that reminds one of the work of Peter Green of Fleetwood Mac, early Fleetwood Mac, before giving way to a Middle Eastern bed of rhythms and sounds. The amazing Goat Brain finds the band in full Afrobeat regalia with a nasty lead line grinding groovy as hell percussion. The band then grows subtler and icier on the album's second half, which finds it experimenting with hip hop beats on the spare yet hypnotic zombie. I could hear, say, Black Thought of the Roots or The Late Gift of Gab from Black Alicious writing the song with lyrical fury. It's that taut and delicious. Album closer Ouroboros winds the proceedings even tighter, unleashing more Afrobeat guitar and electronic drum programming, building to a final swell of electronic noise that beautifully drowns out the song's funky ass riff. Maybe this is weird music made by weird people for weird people, but here in the parallel universe, we call that pop music. And
Sure is.
yep, and no one in the world is doing wacky any better right now than Goat. Goat's Goat is my favorite album of 2024 so far. Maybe not objectively number one, but definitely number one in my heart. I've been listening to it on repeat for the past 3 days now and probably won't stop anytime soon. I'm imagining that you also were a big fan of this record, right, Art?
Oh yeah, it's going to be in my top 10 for the year for sure. Uh, think about Goat, like especially their earlier records. There was always a fuzziness to their sound, really kind of almost kind of lo-fi in a way. With this record, they clean up the sound a bit. It's not as fuzzy as it used to be, but they replaced the fuzz, especially in the first half of the record, with some just wild ass freaky deaky acid rock guitar soloing.
Oh yeah,
Just
unbelievable.
off the chart guitar wonkery in a good way. And then in
Yeah,
the second half of the album is when they bring the funk with songs like you said Ouroboros, which is my favorite track on the record,
yeah.
and Frisco Beaver, which would be a great name for a porno.
Oh yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a cool ass track. I also like the song Dollar Bill.
Which is the one that has the hip hop beat.
That's Zombie.
That's Zombie. It's Zombie. Yeah, hip hop beats and funk. That's the second half of this Goat record, which shows where they're really going forward. And there's another track that you didn't mention because it's an instrumental, kind of an instrumental segue. But track 3, Fool's Journey.
Oh yeah,
Chinese
beautiful, pretty.
Chinese flute music. Basically,
Yep.
it's a Chinese flute music instrumental.
Yeah, and it's really really pretty, and it serves as this kind of odd segue. It sits right in between Goat Brain, which I already
Yeah,
described, and then Dollar
right,
Bill, which is
right.
just plain damn freak out.
Yeah,
That's worthy of, again, it's straight off of like Maggot Brain. It has that kind of
yeah,
nastiness and that kind of just, it's almost unhinged.
right.
It's so freaky deaky. And but Fool's Journey sits in between those, and they kind of pull that trick in the second half too. That in
Right.
between Frisco Beaver and Ouroboros is this little instrumental called All Is One, which
Mm,
in which the guitar solo on that actually approximates the kind of sonics that you're used to hearing from Neil Young, the kind of
yeah,
reverb and echo that one would associate with Neil's 1953 Gibson Les Paul.
yeah.
It kind of shows up there. So yeah, they're a very eclectic band, and just all kinds of vocabulary points and hits uh, all through this album. I mean, it's just for 8 songs and 41 minutes, it really covers a lot of ground.
Right.
It's an exhaustive and exhausting listen, but it's an ass shaker. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming. Led Zeppelin, the legacy of all legacies. I think that's a very apt name because let's face it, they're Led fucking Zeppelin. They're kind of the DNA of what we know as rock and roll these days. Not just classic rock, but modern rock and the postmodern rock and everything that has a meaty fat ass riff and a huge bottom part to it. Has lineage in Led Zeppelin these days. And it's a legacy that Robert Plant, as we'll talk about in this episode, has spent considerable time in the wake of the band's breakup, trying to distance himself from. Well, eventually, come the end of the 80s, even Plant can't hide from Zeppelin anymore. And
Yeah.
I found in my research, he sat down for an interview with Rolling Stone's brilliant writer, David Frick, in March of 1988. He was promoting his terrific album Now and Zen, which, if you've ever heard, is very, very good. So Frick starts talking to Plant about this album, in which he returned to some Zeppelin songs and even sampled
Yeah.
some Zeppelin songs in a
On
couple of
Tall Cool
instances
One. Yeah.
on Tall Cool One, and he does that. So here's that piece of the interview and kind of Plant talking about how he kind of came back to the Zeppelin yard. So Frick asks him, Didn't you feel foolish having renounced Zepp for so long? And responds, no, I had to do that. I remember poor old Clapton years and years before having had this phenomenon with Cream. Every time he tried to play Layla, people would scream for Crossroads. I wanted to establish an identity that was far removed from the howling and the mud sharks of the 70s. So if I go on stage now and sing Misty Mountain Hop, it's cool because I've given it time in between. I can come out and do it without having traded on it all the way down the line. And then Frick asks him, says, Tall Cool One, with its computer samples from Black Dog and Whole Lotta Love, is the first overt reference to Zeppelin you've made on record since the band split. Although the song was done with tongue firmly in cheek, a sense of affection for your past comes through. And Plant answers, especially as throughout every verse there is a sonic bomber guitar sound. I played it to Jimmy Page, and he didn't even know what it was. It's the guitar that goes into the middle bit of Whole Lotta Love. He thought it was just something we'd written in. Then he played the solo on it, and we put all the Zeppelin record bits on at the end. We played it for him, and I'd wish I'd had a camera to catch the expression on his face. Brick says, pleasant surprise? And Plant says, it was more like tiresome wonder. Like, what is he doing, and why is this essential for him? Is he taking the piss out of it? I'm not taking the piss. I'm showing that his riffs are the mightiest the world has ever heard. And Frick says, how did you choose which Zeppelin records to sample? I just picked what I thought was appropriate. In fact, on stage now, we finished Tall Cool One with about a minute of custard pie because it sounds so good. The Ocean was an important one to use because it's been a hit with She's Crafty by the Beastie Boys. Frick says, whereas you were basically borrowing from yourself. And Plant says, well, I borrowed from Jimmy, truth to tell. I've decided that what I wanted to be a bit harder. I want to play stuff that's exciting again. And so that's the end of that. So there you see Plant just kind of, coming to grips and say, you know what we did with Zeppelin was pretty fucking awesome. So now I'm going to embrace it. So if he embraced it, he knew it was the legacy of all legacies. It really is the legacy of all legacies, right, Art?
Yeah, the thing about Robert Plant is that even after this was 1988, even after this, Plant was still playing touch and go with the Zeppelin legacy, whereas Jimmy Page was always all about basically maintaining the Zeppelin spirit through his side projects, through his solo work, whatever he did. Plant always like, okay, I'll do a little Zeppelin stuff here, but I'm going to do something different now. A little something here, a little different now. He never was totally devoted to it. And it's still the same way today. I mean, in 2007, we're going to discuss this later toward the end of this episode, but they did the three surviving members of Zeppelin and Jason Bonham on drums did a show in London, the tribute to Ahmet Ertegun from Atlantic Records. And they did a whole full-on Led Zeppelin show. And Jimmy Page, from all accounts, Page wanted to tour. John Paul Jones wanted to tour as Led Zeppelin. Plant, no. He wanted to tour with Alison Krauss and do the Raising Sand record because it was selling really well, getting a lot of critical attention. And I think for Robert Plant, it was like, it wasn't Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, it was his own thing.
Is his own thing, and that's why it appealed to him. And Plant, I think Plant is in his right to try to not be totally attached to the Zeppelin mythos. People have to remember, Plant had a very successful solo career throughout the 1980s and into the early 90s. He had a lot of hit songs. Go on Wikipedia, look at the chart placings. He had 6 or 7 really popular songs on radio, on rock radio. Mm-hmm. So Tall Cool One is one of them. A bunch of ballads, Big Log, In the Mood, Little by Little, Ship of Fools, which his cover of that was big. I'm always been a fan of 29 Palms from 1993. I mean, and I think his 2005 album, Mighty Rearranger, is his best album. But that being said, yeah, it's fascinating how after John Bonham's death, the dynamic of the members of Led Zeppelin is basically Jimmy Page trying to keep the flame and Robert Plant mostly trying to avoid the flame. And I think one of the reasons for it, I mean, in Mick Wall's excellent book about Led Zeppelin, When Gods Walked Among Us. Hold on a second. Let me check out the title again. It is When Gods Walk the Earth. Sorry, my mistake. When Gods Walk the Earth, he really goes into how Robert Plant in several interviews alluded. He never really specifically and explicitly said, but he basically alluded the fact that from the mid 70s onward, the Zeppelin scene got really dark with the drugs and the excess and the groupies and the groupies getting younger, which seemed to bother Plant a bit, and just the whole drug scene and just everything was bad. And Plant always kind of alluded to like how the second half of the 1970s wasn't fun for him in Led Zeppelin. And I think that's one of the reasons why he's always tried to distance himself, I think. My
Yeah.
personal reason.
Yeah, I mean that makes sense, and that's the kind of thing, because you got to remember, like, and we'll talk about it. The end of the Zeppelin road was not fun, because you had dependencies that
Yeah.
Page and Bonham were both dealing with, that kind of crippled the band and kind of
Mhm.
put Plant and Jones more in the forefront. And so, yeah,
Right.
I can imagine there'd be some resentment that Plant felt for that, especially since then it self-destructed when Bonham died in
Right.
1980. But anyway, that's a topic for a little later in the episode. We have five myths that are popular about Led Zeppelin that we would like to lovingly dispel and call bullshit on, don't we?
Yes, we're going to debunk 5 myths about Led Zeppelin that usually come up from Zeppelin haters. Yes, there are Zeppelin haters out there.
Yes, there are.
Okay, number one, first myth. They weren't a quote unquote songwriting kind of band. This is a myth that can be easily debunked with any deep, attentive listening to Stairway to Heaven. The
Yeah,
meticulously arranged multiple sections, the gorgeous chord progressions, the enigmatic yet beautiful lyricism. If that isn't quality songwriting, then what the fuck is? Then
yeah.
just take a listen to some of the album Physical Graffiti's more striking moments. The languid pastoral role of Down by the Seaside, covered by Tori Amos to beautiful effect in 1995, highlighting the craftsmanship of the track. The lush melodic sweep of 10 Years Gone, the pure pop bliss of Houses of the Holy, the epic grandeur of Kashmir. And look no further than the second half of Led Zeppelin 3, with the beautiful country music stylings of Tangerine and the perfect folk construction of That's the Way. And there are many, many more to mention, as we will when we get to the albums. Chris?
Yeah, they had a depth to them that and they were a very eclectic band. You've already mentioned,
Yeah,
like, Led Zeppelin 3. It's the one with the immigrant song on it, but it's also the one that has the entirely acoustic second half of the album.
yeah, yeah,
Like the entire second half is
yeah.
is acoustic, and not just Tangerine, but like Run Yar Stomp, which,
Right.
where they kind of get into a country kind of like almost honky tonk kind of ditty.
Yeah,
And so, there's that. And, they also, they had a pretty extensive rock and roll vocabulary, that Bonham was deeply influenced by James Brown. And
yeah.
there was a clear, at least from the mid 70s on, there was a clear rockabilly influence. Like the,
Sure.
the album Presence, there's a rockabilly
Okay.
vibe going on through the entire thing. So yeah, they had some depth to them, and they were really really rich in how they constructed their songs, and a lot of epic stuff. I mean, they were like the masters of the 8 minute epic song. I
Yeah,
mean, they wrote the 8 minute epic song
yeah,
in Stairway to Heaven, but but
yeah.
but but
Right,
they have at least a half dozen more 8 minute epics and
right.
11 minute epics. So they just incredible songwriters.
Yeah. Myth number two: Jimmy Page was a sloppy guitarist, therefore not great. In recent decades, and especially in social media in recent years, there's been a small movement among more technical minded music fans that Page wasn't a technically perfect guitarist and was sometimes quite sloppy. Some hardcore guitarists will definitely note that there were more proficient, more virtuosic stylists out there, such as Eric Clapton, Jeff Beck, and Jimi Hendrix. But other musicians will also note that Page had his very own unique and inventive style that sounded like no one before him and was ripped off constantly and consistently by many guitarists in rock afterward. Much like you say, Chris, with the difference between Neil Young and Stephen Stills. Stills was technically more gifted, but Young's choppy style was way more interesting to listen to and, in the end, inspired way more musicians in other bands. Chris?
Yeah, he definitely. I mean, you mentioned Beck and Clapton, that those guys. Yeah, I mean, in terms of technical proficiency, you can't beat them. But in terms of creativity, they had nothing on Page. Page was just he just was very inventive, and he experimented. Just had a liveliness to his playing, and a real sense of adventure. The violin bow on Dazed and Confused, and the instrumental, which part of it is on the first record, White Summer, Black Mountainside. That whole thing is just marvelous. And or like even like the instrumental from Physical Graffiti, Bron-Y-Aur. He just has there's a prettiness to his acoustic playing, and just sure, it was rambling a little bit, but then you get like the song like Candy Store Rock, where again he appropriates rockabilly, and it's just this just really fun, really magnetic playing. And so I've never, I'm one of those people that, I'm not a guitarist and I'm not a technician, so I'm not in a position to criticize him for whatever lack of technical playing. So what? It sounds really fucking great, and it rocks, and it's all over the place, and it's just cool.
Yeah.
And that's all that matters. He was just a cool player that came up with some great sounds.
Yeah, and he invented a style of rock music, basically. Clapton didn't do that. Neither did
Nope.
Jeff Beck. Sorry,
Nope.
guys. Number three, myth number three, that they weren't original. Now, I understand
Bullshit.
where this. Oh, I understand where this one comes from. Particularly with the first two Zeppelin albums, there was a lot of plagiarism and uncredited lifting of others' songs, especially riffs, melodies, and lyrics from older American blues artists and more obscure folk singers. We'll definitely get into these song thefts as we later dive into the albums, but let it be known that Page, Plant, and Company definitely got better at crediting others from the third album onward. On top of that, what Led Zeppelin did with these stolen, borrowed bits and pieces of songs is elevate them to a level where they would never have been remembered if it weren't for Zeppelin pumping them up with, well, lead and making them memorable rock classics. The other side to this knock comes from just plain old Zepp haters who stubbornly hold on to the idea of Cream and Hendrix being the true innovators. Sure, that's true. But in no way were Zeppelin imitators of those two legendary artists. Only a total fucking idiot listens to Led Zeppelin and claims that they sound just like Cream and Hendrix. Like you have to be stupid to say that.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like I said in my parameter setter at the beginning of this episode, they took the heavy psychedelic rock innovations of those two, Cream and Hendrix, and built upon those foundations, added more stylistic influences than those two ever did, and thereby created the form and the structure for heavy metal. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, basically, all you have to do is like listen to some of the stuff from Led Zeppelin too. I mean, yeah, sure, they might have stolen some of the lyrics that are in the Lemon Song and Bring It On Home, but those songs are just nasty in terms of the guitar playing and the bottom heaviness of them, and Bonham's guitar drumming, and just, I mean, there's just a grandeur to what they were doing, and like When the Levee Breaks. I mean, that just with that booming, echoing harmonica part on there, and just the swagger, and that's the thing, that they really lent a swagger to their arrangements that not a whole lot of bands could approximate, and just a heaviness and a power that just blew out the fucking speakers. And so, they weren't original, my ass. Yeah, sure, they lifted some lyrics. And they like themselves some Willie Dixon, and they like some Robert Johnson. But who didn't? I mean, and fine, so they had to give a few bucks a few years later on that. But that doesn't mean they weren't original. What they were doing with it, like you said, they basically invented heavy metal. In taking those, it's just heavy blues rock with like awesome riffing guitars and like the heaviest drums that have ever been laid on tape.
Yeah. All right. Myth number 4. They were the reason for all the dumb, bloated, misogynist cock rock that came after. Now, this is more.
Come on, that's just rock and roll.
Well, I would say this is more bullshit from Zepp haters. This is a simple case of don't blame the influencers for the influencees. Or better yet, don't blame the innovators for the imitators. Zeppelin's music could be big, could be bloated, and could be construed as a bit sexist with many of their women done me wrong lyrics, but I absolutely reject the notion that Zeppelin should be held accountable for some of early Van Halen's shallow corniness, mostly attributed to David Lee Roth, or Grand Funk Railroad's chest-pumping indulgences, or the sleek arena rock of later bands like Boston, Journey, or Foreigner, or 1980s glam metal's utterly offensive misogyny and stupidity. In fact, it's safe to say that the members of Led Zeppelin, as both Robert Plant and Jimmy Page have alluded to in endless interviews, didn't like most, if not any, of their 1970s and 80s imitators. Chris?
Yeah, and they shouldn't have. It's kind of a stretch for anyone to blame Kiss or like Motley Crue's Girls on Led Zeppelin.
Yeah,
because a lot of what they did was, they did, like you said, the woman done me wrong thing, but they weren't like like some of the stuff Kiss was doing. They didn't have a song like Room Service,
right,
and anywhere in their catalog, or any of that kind of like big dumb pop on my cock kind of stuff. No, they didn't do that, and granted, they, and even by In Through the Outdoor, they pretty much gone saccharine. I'm gonna crawl and All of My Love and In the Evening and Fool in the Rain. I mean, so they had kind of they had lost some of that cock rockiness at the end. So they did grow up, and but they didn't have, and granted, about the dirtiest they ever got was Squeeze the Lemon Until the Juice Runs Down My Leg.
Which isn't really their lyric.
And it wasn't even them. They were appropriating that shit. So that's what I'm saying. It's just kind of like saying that, the dumb macho posture.
Yeah.
Sure, any white boy band from London of that age had the macho, the cocky posture. But but again, as I said at the beginning of this, dumb, bloated, misogynist cock rock, that's just rock and roll.
For a lot of bands, for sure.
White male rock and roll is basically all dumb and bloated and over the top. I mean, that's just kind of a defining characteristic of the hard rock genre.
Yeah. Now, the myth number 5, that they were a band that was just quote unquote for the boys. This myth fails to acknowledge the simple fact that Led Zeppelin had an enormous female fan base.
Oh, yeah.
Then and now. Seriously, just look at photos or video footage of Zeppelin's concerts from the 70s. There are at least just as many women there as there are men. For a band known for their macho cock rock, they really did embrace their feminine side, or at least Page and Plant did.
Yeah.
And it showed not just in their stage attire, but in the sensitivity that they injected into their music and their songwriting.
They did stuff like the Battle of Evermore and Thank You.
Yeah, I know. And all of that was a wonderful counterbalance to the heaviness and the crunching riffs that they were known for. I mentioned earlier how Tori Amos wonderfully covered Zeppelin in 1995's Encomium tribute compilation. Here's a list of other female or female-dominant artists who were inspired and even directly influenced by the genius of Led Zeppelin. Heart, the 1970s Seattle band featuring Ann and Nancy Wilson. This one is obvious if you just listen to their classic 70s hits. Slater, Kinney, especially their early to mid noughties period.
Oh, yeah.
Where Janet Weiss's drums acquired a very John Bonham-esque heaviness, and Carrie Brownstein's riffs became curiously Jimmy Page-ish. Hole, Courtney Love's grunge band, especially in their early years, had a distinctly punk influence that merged with Zeppelin-esque heaviness. L7.
I was going to say.
Their brand of trashy biker grunge had a distinctly Zeppelin-esque heaviness and especially swagger. PJ Harvey. Just listen to her greatest album, 1993's Rid of Me. And I dare you to tell me that the heavy blues rock via grunge sound of that record isn't indebted to Led Zeppelin. Go ahead. I dare you. And of course, there are female pop artists whose music sounds nothing like Zeppelin to my ears, but have gone on record saying Zeppelin was an inspiration. Madonna, Shakira, Lady Gaga, and even fucking Katie Malua. all we need is Taylor Swift to make a Zeppelin sounding record, and the circle will be complete.
And
Chris?
she could probably pull it off. She's a good enough songwriter. I would love to hear Taylor Swift try to do a Zeppelin-esque record. Basically, you want to talk about their female fan base. All you have to do is like watch The Song Remains the Same, the movie, and you realize from the concert footage that a co-star of the movie is Robert Plant Jr. because you cannot escape Jr. in those tights.
Yeah,
it's like it's practically all the way down to Robert Plant's knees. That man was impressively hung. And so that's what I'm saying. So they had their fans, and it wasn't just the women that were getting mud sharks in the twat.
Yeah, well, that's the bad side of it.
Yeah, I know. It wasn't just the groupies. It was they really did have a sensitive song. I mentioned Thank You, or Sensitive Side. I mentioned Thank You, and they had even stuff like Ramble On. Has a certain tenderness to it or Going to California.
Right.
So they had a tenderness to them that really kind of spoke to women as well. Yeah. And they again, they actually, and Robert Plant was a legitimate sex symbol. Dick jokes aside, he was a legitimate sex symbol. So there you go. So we have dispelled 5 myths, and to all you haters out there, fuck you.
And actually, there aren't as many haters as there used to be, seriously, because of all those like big giant bands of the 60s and 70s. Led Zeppelin are one. We're gonna mention this later, and we'll repeat it later. But they're one of the bands that have aged the best the most for a younger generation of music fans.
Oh, I agree. Oh. Yeah, absolutely. You go to any school of rock, and Led Zeppelin is alive. Yeah. In any of those programs.
Arguably, I mean, I'll touch on this later, but arguably bigger than the Beatles for a younger generation of fans. I'm a university teacher. I'm always in contact with younger people and students, and they keep being the same age while I keep getting older. And I've noticed this. I can spot the music geeks in the classroom, and I talk to them. And seriously, dude, like, when it comes to older bands that like the Zoomers meaning the Gen Z people, it's Nirvana, it's Oasis, it's Radiohead, it's Led Zeppelin, a little bit of the Beatles too, AC/DC, oddly enough. It's weird, but anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, who knew AC/DC was like the house band of Korea? But Zeppelin is one of those of the baby boomer generation bands. They're one of the bands that have aged the best, if not the best, out of all of them. But we'll talk about that later. Yep, absolutely.
All right. Okay, now, Led Zeppelin's origin story, and it's a long one, and it's an entangled one. So let's get it going. All right, any account of the history of Led Zeppelin has to start with guitarist Jimmy Page. From the early to mid-1960s, Page made a name for himself in the British music scene as a top session musician. For those who aren't familiar with the parlance, a session musician is someone who gets paid to play on records by other artists and bands. This covers any and all kinds of music, and this was especially so for Page, who played on records and albums for artists of a wide range spectrum, covering folk, pop, rock and roll, jazz, R&B, soul, etc., etc. Session musicians, especially during this time, made really good money. But Page had an itch to showcase himself more as a creative force, not just a good professional guitarist who was good at being told what to play. Hence his decision upon being invited to join the Yardbirds in 1966. The Yardbirds were one of London's premier blues-based rock bands that were quite popular at the time, a little more so than, say, the Pretty Things, but nowhere near as popular as, say, the Rolling Stones. What separated the Yardbirds from other bands on the scene was their penchant for long, improvised jamming that often led to rave-up crescendos. Once a vehicle for Eric Clapton's virtuoso guitar playing after he left to join John Mayall and the Blues Breakers, his spot was soon taken by Jeff Beck. Page was recruited to be the bass player, but he soon switched to guitar to give the band a dual guitar attack. By late 66, Beck left the band to form the Jeff Beck Group with Rod Stewart on vocals, and Page became the sole guitarist in a classic quartet lineup. A bit of information regarding the Yardbirds' infrastructure is needed here. They were managed by a small talent management agency called RAK Music Management, headed by Mickey Most, a well-known producer at the time who made a bunch of hit singles for artists such as Donovan, Herman's Hermits, and The Animals. His number two guy in the company was this huge, hulking former pro wrestler and former actor by the name of Peter Grant, who acted as tour manager for the Yardbirds. Grant got his start in the music management business in 1963, acting as tour manager and overall minder for the infamous Don Arden and his management company. Arden worked as a booking agent and freelance manager in the UK for numerous American acts who came to tour in Britain: Chuck Berry, Little Richard, Bo Diddley, the Everly Brothers, and Gene Vincent, among others. I use the word infamous to describe Arden because he was well known not just for his criminal underworld connections, but also for his, shall we say, excessive and sometimes violent ways he resolved conflicts, especially with concert promoters. These were lessons Grant picked up quickly and informed the way he would do business with Led Zeppelin in the future. Grant wasn't just a brute, though. He was sharp, bright, quick-witted, a quick learner, and especially brilliant in managing finances and taking care of an artist's money. Perhaps his most important skill, though, was in relating to his charges on a personal level, being honest to a fault, taking them in as practical family, and always encouraging their artistic freedom while putting their interests first. Within a year, he left Arden's employ and teamed up with Mickey Most in 1964. Soon after, Jeff Beck left the Yardbirds in late 66, with Jimmy Page taking on a greater creative role in the band. Grant formed a close bond with Page that would prove crucial in the near future. The Yardbirds of 1967 were, as you might expect, a more psychedelic affair that incorporated more explicit folk influences, sonic and instrumental experimentation, and an increasing deviation from their blues roots into a harder rock sound, no doubt inspired by Cream and Jimi Hendrix. Unfortunately, though, they weren't producing hits anymore, although they remained a pretty popular concert draw in the American club and ballroom circuit. Nevertheless, the Yardbirds splintered in early 1968, with singer Keith Relf wanting to go in a more folk rock direction. Peter Grant decided to leave Most's company and go into talent management himself, making Jimmy Page and whatever band he wanted to form as his sole clients. Interesting story. Around this time, Page wanted to poach bassist John Entwistle and drummer Keith Moon from The Who and form a supergroup with either Traffic's Steve Winwood or the Small Faces' Steve Marriott on vocals.
Wow, could you imagine?
Obviously, this never materialized, but it's one of the greatest what ifs in rock history. I got this from Mick Wall's superb Led Zeppelin biography, When Gods Walk the Earth. Even though the Yardbirds were functionally and creatively finished, they still had touring commitments through the middle of 1968. Keith Relf gave Page and bassist Chris Dreja permission to continue using the Yardbirds name to fulfill those obligations, hence the need for a new drummer and singer. Page really wanted in-demand singer Terry Reid to front this new temporary version of the Yardbirds, but while he declined, he recommended a young, tall, charismatic 20-year-old from Birmingham named Robert Plant. At the time, Plant was in a local band called the Band of Joy. Plant accepted the job and in turn recommended a drummer he knew, another Birmingham lad by the name of John Bonham. Bonham had a reputation in the Birmingham scene as a fiercely talented drummer who played loud as fuck. He was also known to be pretty cocky and arrogant as well as being a belligerent drunk. This behavior would become worse as Bonham's alcoholism would worsen over the years, but it was his virtuoso drumming skills that persuaded Jimmy Page to bring him into the fold. Shortly after, Chris Dredja quit the band to pursue a career in photography, but the vacancy didn't last long. Page knew and had worked before with a guy he knew in the London session musician scene named John Paul Jones and promptly recruited him to the band as bassist. Jones was also a superbly talented keyboardist and a classically trained musician who could read and write music as well as score string arrangements. We'll go into this later as we discuss the albums, but Jones would prove to be Led Zeppelin's true secret weapon in their lineup.
Yep.
They rehearsed and fulfilled the Scandinavian late summer, early fall tour obligations as the New Yardbirds and planned to keep the name. However, Chris Dredja issued a cease and desist letter to the band and their management regarding their use of the name beyond the Scandinavian tour, so a new name was needed. The common story of how the band got their name and permanent name has been corroborated by several sources. Remember that supergroup Jimmy Page envisioned with the Who's John Entwistle and Keith Moon?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Jeff Beck was also envisioned by Page to be part of that band. Moon and Entwistle reportedly joked that such a band would go down like a lead balloon. Bingo! Page must have remembered that comment, and at the suggestion of Peter Grant, the L-E-A-D spelling was changed to L-E-D, so people wouldn't pronounce it as lead. According to music journalist Keith Shadwick, it was Page who came up with the word Zeppelin to replace balloon because the former word, to Page's mind, quote, brought the perfect combination of heavy and light, combustibility and grace, end quote. Thus, they would now be called Led Zeppelin. Starting in September, after their Scandinavian tour and finishing in October 1968, while they were transitioning from being the New Yardbirds to being Led Zeppelin, the band went into the studio with Jimmy Page funding and producing the whole thing himself to record what would be their first album, completely based on what was their live set at the time. While this was happening, Peter Grant flew to the US to secure a record deal for his seemingly hot new band. As a session musician, Page was a well-known commodity in the music industry, and the Yardbirds were well respected. Grant could be a charmer when he wanted to be, and it didn't take long for him to find takers. Atlantic Records was one of the US's biggest and best labels at the time, specializing in blues, R&B, soul, and jazz. Remember, this was the home of Ray Charles.
Yep.
They had found huge success in the area of rock with Cream, but with that band recently broken up, they needed a new flagship rock band. Equipped with only an acetate of the ongoing recordings of Led Zeppelin's first album, Jimmy Page's reputation, and his own outsized personality, Peter Grant was able to convince the executives at Atlantic, at this point now owned by Warner Brothers, to sign the band without ever even having heard them live. The deal was made in November 1968, and the band was given what was then a whopping $143,000 advance. That's like roughly $2 million by today's money.
Wow.
In addition, they were given complete autonomy over what they would release, when they would release their records, when they would tour, and the contents, cover art, and design of their albums. Complete artistic control over everything. And of course, this is all speaking in terms of physical media, of course.
Yep.
All this was unprecedented in the music business at the time. And in industry circles, Led Zeppelin and Peter Grant's outlandish approach to talent management were already starting to get a reputation as a quote-unquote big hype, for better or for worse. From late October through early December, they toured the UK and select European cities with their new name. Right after Christmas, they embarked on their first North American tour, opening for the likes of Vanilla Fudge and Iron Butterfly, and in short order started to headline their own club and ballroom gigs due to word-of-mouth buzz over their fierce, powerful Take No Prisoners live shows and spellbinding extended improvisations. The legend of Led Zeppelin had begun. Chris?
Yeah, good run through of the origin story. I will say this. Fortuitous circumstance can often be the nectar of rock and roll in a lot of ways,
Yeah.
and the fact that Plant or the Page was able to hook up with two 20-year-old kids from Birmingham, England,
Yeah.
and they turn out to be Robert Plant and John Bonham.
Yeah.
That is fortuitous
Right.
in the grandest sense of the word. That he kind of lucked out that he wanted Steve Winwood or Steve Marriott and Keith Moon. He got
Yeah.
Plant and Bonham, so I think he
Yeah.
made out okay in the deal.
Yeah.
So pretty extraordinary. Yeah, I mean they the Yardbirds obviously had a good run. If you've ever seen the movie Blow Up by the director Antonini,
Yeah.
the Yardbirds are the house band for the party,
Right.
and so Page makes an appearance there. So
Yeah.
yeah, they were a pretty fashionable band, and so it was a kind of a hard act to follow because they really did have a successful run of albums and of songs, and so but obviously they were able to exceed it, and so fortuitousness indeed.
On this episode, we analyzed the overwhelming legacy of Led Zeppelin. For the next episode, this podcast's resident Neil Youngologist, Curmudgeon Chris, is going to break down the third and latest of Uncle Neil's archive series. Spanning the years 1976 through 87, Young's latest and most massive installment includes complete live shows, alternate versions of previously released material, outtakes from albums, and never before released material from various studio sessions. It also stylistically runs the gamut from his peak mid-1970s period through to his early 1980s experiments with synth pop and electronica to his wacky mid-1980s obsession with rockabilly. A while back, we did an episode highlighting the best of Neil's first two archive series box sets. Well, Uncle Neil did us all a favor by releasing a 16-track sampler of this third volume. You can forgive yours truly, Curmudgeons, for not wanting to spend $450 on the entire box set, which as of now is the only way to listen to the Archives Volume 3. So we're going to break down this sampler that he produced as well as other tracks from the box set that you can find on YouTube and other places. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the Neil Young Archives Volume 3 Takes Disc, a curmudgeonly review. All right, now let's delve into the albums. 8 studio albums by the mighty Led Zeppelin. The first one, obviously, self-titled from 1969, released in January 1969, right in the middle of Zeppelin's first North American tour. It's really difficult for people in today's modern era of music fandom, where Led Zeppelin's overall sound and music is taken for granted and accepted as canonical inevitability, to understand and appreciate how utterly, or maybe even surreally, groundbreaking, innovative, and spellbindingly original this band's music and their first album was to people listening for the first time. And this isn't to mention how heart-stoppingly, head-poundingly, punishingly heavy this music was. As I've mentioned several times, artists like Cream and Jimi Hendrix had already introduced new dimensions and dynamics as to how heavy rock music could be just 2 years earlier. But this was something different. This was the next step in the evolution. This was the first music that could be roughly identified as the term that would come into fashion very soon in rock music vernacular: heavy metal. But there were other things going on here than just hard, heavy, blues-based rock, albeit harder and heavier than anything ever recorded before. There was a dark, moody atmosphere at work, rippling through the grooves of the vinyl. As a producer, Jimmy Page's expert use of space, and as musicians like to call, quote, the sound of the room where they recorded, was haunting and unsettling, even made more so by the contrasts of light and dark provided by Jimmy Page's injection of traditional English and Scottish folk music into the band's sonic brew, as well as eerie psychedelia courtesy of his drawing whacked out sounds from his guitar using a violin bow. But make no mistake, the basic template for Led Zeppelin's sound was well established on this album. Page's gargantuan, larger-than-life guitar riffs, John Bonham's thick and meaty sound that disguised an impeccable sense of timekeeping and finesse when needed, and Robert Plant's soaring banshee wailing that peeled paint off the walls and set the standard for what forever would be heavy metal vocalizing. Now, let's address the theft of other artists' music, a criticism that has always been leveled at Led Zeppelin. Of the 9 tracks on the album, only 3 are purely original songs with no borrowing. The thundering blast off of the lead track, Good Times, Bad Times, the lush tapestry of acoustic guitars that define the folk rock of Your Time Is Gonna Come, and the full-on crunch riff heavy metal assault, but with proto-punk energy of Communication Breakdown. The gorgeous acoustic textures and loud, soft dynamic that characterize Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You frame what is actually a cover of a gorgeous folk song by Anne Breeden. And in fact, she is properly credited along with Jimmy Page and Robert Plant in the song credits. The heavy yet slow as molasses grunge blues of You Shook Me is correctly and completely credited to Willie Dixon and J.B. Lenoir. Now, as for the epic psychedelic metal blast of Dazed and Confused, one of Zeppelin's signature songs, yeah, Page stole the whole credit for it. Yep. The melody, the lyrics, and even that stalking bass line in the intro are all from the song's composer, folk singer Jake Holmes, although Page is responsible for the arrangements and sonic expansion of the track, making it wholly identifiable as a Led Zeppelin song for generations to come. The acoustic guitar instrumental Black Mountainside is also falsely credited to Page, when it is in fact a basic ripoff of British folky Bert Jansch's arrangement of the traditional Irish folk song Down by Black Waterside. The seductive slow blues of I Can't Quit You Baby is correctly and wholly credited to Willie Dixon, but the album closer, the towering rumbling How Many More Times, essentially steals the basic melody and some of the lyrics from Howlin' Wolf's How Many More Years, while other lyrics in the song, the Call Me the Hunter part, were taken from an Albert King performance of a song by Booker T and the MGs. So, on 3 of the 9 tracks, bad on you for the theft, Led Zeppelin. Chris?
Yeah, who cares? I mean, it's just one of these things. They were just so damn good at stealing, and they just made the stuff into their own. I mean, the heart of this record comes at the end. It's a 1-2 punch right at the end of I Can't Quit You Baby and How Many More Times.
Yeah.
You know, the first of those songs is sensual as hell and just heavy and just, just a bass boom bang type of song. And How Many More Times is just completely it's so fucking hard and just blasted that it's almost unhinged. And just the way that it manages to keep together, it just speaks to the power of John Bonham. It just awesome stuff. And I've always been a huge fan of Black Mountainside, even if it is stolen from Bert Jansch, it's just really pretty. And it just kind of showed even there, like in the midst of all this like awesomely thumping stuff, that Page takes a detour into something folky and something more mystical, and it just kind of it presages the stuff that was to come. It portends. So just great record. It's almost so heavy. It's so heavy and so loud. It's almost nihilistic in how it's done. So it's just a really well done record.
Yeah. Next, Led Zeppelin 2, also from 1969. If the first album created a new vocabulary for rock music and made Led Zeppelin overnight stars, their second album made them major superstars, thanks to the worldwide success of the single Whole Lotta Love, with one of the most instantly recognizable, iconic guitar riffs in music history. If the first album provided the shape of heavy metal, this album was bona fide, filled out heavy metal. one year before Black Sabbath popularized the term, with a fierce, brutal, in-your-face assault that outrocked any and everything that had come before. Yes, this was the album that knocked the Beatles' Abbey Road off the top of the US Billboard album chart, symbolically and literally ushering in a new era. And yes, it is better than Abbey Road. Whereas their debut album has that dark, moody atmosphere and tinges of psychedelia, this record is, for the most part, pure crunch, power, and adrenaline. And there's a good reason for this. Zeppelin spent pretty much all of 1969 on the road, doing 4 European and 3 North American concert tours. All the songs were written while they were on tour, during rehearsals and sound checks, and recorded, overdubbed, and mixed in various studios in the US and the UK whenever they had time to spare. Basically, it was recorded hit and run. Tour, 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 go to the studio, record some stuff, tour again, go to another studio, tour again. Basically, that's how they recorded this. They were physically, mentally, and emotionally on the go all the time. And the pure visceral energy from being in performance mode all the time predictably poured into the sound of the album. This is the record that most accurately reflected what a force of nature Led Zeppelin was at this early part of their career. It was also this album that solidified Jimmy Page's radical approach to songwriting. That is, making the guitar riff the main hook of the song. Okay, theft alert time. While the music for Whole Lotta Love is all Zeppelin, Robert Plant proves to be the thief here. The lyrics borrow very liberally from a Muddy Waters song written by Willie Dixon called You Need Love. In 1966, the Small Faces covered the song and renamed it You Need Loving, and vocalist Steve Marriott's vocal phrasing and verse melody were also swiped by Plant, almost verbatim. In 1985, Dixon sued the band, and the matter was settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, with all subsequent reissues of the album and or song containing Dixon's name in the credits. The bruising, blasting slice of blues metal that is the Lemon Song is essentially a rewrite of the Howlin' Wolf song Killing Floor. And Chester Burnett, Howlin' Wolf, didn't get his due songwriting credit until he sued the band in 1972, with both parties settling out of court. By the way, the Lemon Song also contains a lyrical quote from Robert Johnson's Traveling Riverside Blues. And finally, there's Bring It On Home, one of this curmudgeon's all-time favorite Zeppelin songs of what is mostly a Zeppelin song. The slow, bluesy intro and outro parts were essentially stolen from a Sonny Boy Williamson song, also written by Willie Dixon, and the publishing arm of Chess Records, Dixon's label, sued the band. Again, it was settled out of court with an undisclosed cash settlement. And since 2003, the song has been credited solely to Willie Dixon. Chris?
And again, who cares? Because it's Zeppelin. I mean, it's not a better record than Abbey Road. You got that wrong.
Yes, it is.
But
yes, it is.
But it is more viscerally exciting. In fact,
and it's more influential.
Yeah, and in fact, it may actually be the most viscerally exciting rock and roll album of all time. It just there's something about it. There's an energy and a focus and just a bashedness to it that just brings you in there. And it just even like stuff like Thank You and Living Loving Maid and Ramble On. I mean, just and like Moby Dick. It just, the stuff that's not exactly, it doesn't sound like it's live, but the way that it's done in the studio is just, it has a preciousness to it.
It captures the energy of a live performance because they were in performance mode during the whole time. They were constantly on tour.
Yeah, it's performance mode. So it is a performed album and performed exceedingly well. And again, it's just a huge accomplishment. Like the song Heartbreaker is just awesome. And just, that's just awesome. I mean, Moby Dick with John Bonham's just amazing drum solo is awesome. And what I've always liked about this record is that like when I was 16, I was a huge, as a Christmas gift, I got the Led Zeppelin box set, which was a 4 CD compilation of all of a cross section of their albums. And 7 of the 9 songs from Led Zeppelin 2 were on that Led Zeppelin box set. The
Yeah.
only two that weren't turned out to be my favorite songs on the record, which are the Lemon Song and Bring It On Home.
Yeah.
They were not in the Led Zeppelin box set, but they should have been because they're both fucking awesome. And just the riffs are just magnifique,
Yeah.
especially on Bring It On Home. I mean, that is just a gourmet metal riff
Yep.
if there ever was one. So yeah, I'm a huge fan of this record. Just the performance, the energy, the visceral excitement. It just you can't beat it. Just
Yeah.
awesome.
Right. Eat your heart out, John, Paul, George, and Ringo. All right, next. Led Zeppelin 3 from 1970. Perhaps the most underrated and underappreciated album in the band's catalog. It's also the pivot point in their career, the record where they started to really experiment with different styles, textures, and sounds. By this point, they weren't a big, dumb, macho cock rock band anymore. There was a grace, a deftness of touch, and an increasing emotional depth to their songs now, even the ones that rocked. The first half of the album continues the forward thrust momentum of the previous album with what I call the Viking metal strut of the Immigrant Song. The gloomy yet aggressive acoustic romp of Friends, complete with an incredible John Paul Jones string arrangement, the strident heavy groove of Out on the Tiles, and Since I've Been Loving You, quite possibly Led Zeppelin's most moving, most powerful, most authentically beautiful, pure blues song ever. Blues ballad, even. The second half of the album is something else entirely. Zeppelin goes bucolic. That's right. The
Hmm.
strands of traditional English and Scottish folk music that has always permeated through the band's lumbering rhythms and bulldozer riffs come right out to the forefront, along with a healthy dose of American folk and country music. Gallows Pole, properly credited as a traditional song arranged by Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, starts plaintively enough, then stretches out into full throttle folk rock that acoustically rocks out as hard as anything they did electrically. Tangerine, which dates back to Page's time with the Yardbirds, is a gorgeous piece of country rock that would fit snugly in any album by the Byrds. Once you get to the languid, lush folk ballad, That's the Way, and the galloping country hoedown of Braun ER, Stomp, you get the sense of a restlessly experimental and dynamic band dying to break out of the world of hard rock, heavy metal cliches. Okay, theft alert time. Guess what? There's very, very little of it here. Led Zeppelin got a lot of flack from both critics and music industry insiders for their liberal borrowing with crediting. So, starting with this album, they got better about that. Robert Plant's opening and closing lyrics in Since I've Been Loving You are almost identical to the lyrics from Moby Grape's 1968 song Never, and Bronny R. Stomp is very influenced by, but in no means identical to, Scottish folk musicians Bert Jansch's Wagoner's Lad. That's about it. Chris?
Yeah, okay. So only a little bit of only a little bit of theft, but still, who cares? I keep saying that because Led Zeppelin was just Led Zeppelin, and yeah, this album is sensational. I love the eclecticism of it, and just the fact that you have your cock rockers like Immigrant Song and Out on the Tiles, which I love, by the way. I mean, Out on the Tiles is probably my favorite song on this album. It
Yeah.
just it just rocks balls. And then you get the blues of Since I've Been Loving You, which I Since I've Been Loving You is one of my favorite songs from Zeppelin. Uh, I'm especially a fan of, and I'm gonna to segue a little bit here, and I have to give a plug to two live performances or two live recordings from Zeppelin. They released a three CD live album in 2003 called How the West Was Won, which is just awesome and
Yeah.
has like the best version of Since I've Been Loving You I've ever heard on it. It just
Mm.
has a depth and just real balls to it, like a real heaviness to it that even this doesn't capture. I mean, it's pretty heavy on here, but like just live, it is just more space, more boom, more bottom. It's just awesome. And Immigrant Song on that album too, the How the West Was Won album is just fucking incredible. And
Yeah.
it's just because here it's a little thin, but
Yeah.
there it gets it gets a huge bottom
Yeah.
and just more soloing and just it goes on for 3.5 minutes as opposed to 2.5 minutes
Right.
and is just sensational. So I have to give it up for How the West Was Won. I also have to give it up for a performance that Arturo shared with me this week that I wasn't actually familiar with until now. It's a show that the Zepp played on January 9th, 1970 at the Royal Albert Hall in London. And it's them at the top and at the height of their powers. And
Yeah.
just everything is just the heaviest, loudest, just gnarliest band imaginable, just freaking out and just improving and just masters of the craft and masters of the live performance. And just incredible how they were doing that. And I believe since I've been loving you shows up on that one too.
No, it
Uh,
doesn't. It doesn't.
yeah, I think it was in the original set. I saw a set list for that night, and
Mhm.
it was in that set list, but it doesn't show up in the movie though.
Yeah.
Uh, so I got that one a little bit wrong, but it's an exceptional piece of tape. I encourage anybody out there to go try to find it on the torrents. There's bits and pieces of it on YouTube as well. Again, that's January 9th, 1970, uh,
Yep.
Royal Albert Hall.
Royal Albert.
Uh,
Yeah, it's a
brill,
classic.
brilliant show.
Yeah.
So I mentioned that only because that here we are in 1970, and there they were in 1970, just getting ready to dominate the world, and getting more sophisticated and getting more confident. And even like the Gallows Pole, it might be
Yeah.
acoustic, but that song's got swagger like a motherfucker.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And it's one of my
Yeah,
favorite Zeppelin songs too. Well, I mean, it's a mostly a Zeppelin song. It actually is kind of a
yeah,
it's a cover. It's a
it's a
tradition. It's
traditional
a
folk
tradition.
song.
Yeah. So
But I'm just saying the way that they rock it out, even though it's acoustic,
yeah.
it just kind of shows you the swagger that they
Yeah.
were working with at that point.
Right. Speaking of swagger, the next album, Led Zeppelin 4 from 1971. Now, before this album, Zeppelin were rock music's premier practitioners of hard rock and heavy metal. After this album, they essentially became the biggest band in the world. So much has been written and said about this flawless, monumentally influential, and historical record that it defies hyperbole. The simplest way I can put it is that it is both a consolidation and a fine-tuning perfection of the Led Zeppelin formula, while also being an all-out sonic and stylistic expansion. Who the hell on this planet doesn't know the epic, slow building, multi-layered, multi-textured masterpiece that is Stairway to Heaven, the band's signature song? You have the stop-start rumble and bodacious riff inspired by, not stolen from, Howlin' Wolf's Smokestack Lightning of Black Dog. Rock and roll starts with the drum intro from Little Richard's Keep a Knockin' and launches into hyperspace like Chuck Berry on both jet fuel and cocaine. The Battle of Evermore is stately English folk music at its most enchanting, with Robert Plant indulging in his lyrical J.R.R. Tolkien fantasies and featuring the only guest vocalist to ever appear on a Zeppelin song, British folk singer Sandy Denny. Misty Mountain Hop is pure Tolkien-inspired lyrical reverie, but put to a cyclical, elliptical, electric piano groove. Four Sticks features the first appearance of a synthesizer on a Led Zeppelin song, courtesy of John Paul Jones, as well as a lush, multi-tracked wall of sound of guitar, and one of the gnarliest, weirdest time signatures you'll ever hear on a rock record. The gentle folk of Going to California is an ode to Joni Mitchell, whom both Jimmy Page and Robert Plant were enthralled by, and proves how in touch with their feminine side these guys really were. And finally, the song Mojo Magazine called Led Zeppelin's greatest song in an issue back in the late noughties, the sludgy, psychedelic, hypnotic blues dirge of When the Levee Breaks, a song so difficult to recreate live that they only attempted to do so a handful of times. Led Zeppelin had become much more disciplined, responsible, and more importantly, judicious with their quote unquote borrowing by this time. While the music of When the Levee Breaks is entirely an original Zeppelin construction, the lyrics are straight off from the song of the same name by old-time blues singer-songwriter Memphis Minnie. And yes, she got credited along with the rest of the band. However, the most controversial case of possible borrowing on this album is in regard to Stairway to Heaven. For years, fans and journalists have cited how the song's opening acoustic guitar arpeggios are eerily similar to the 1968 song Taurus by Los Angeles-based band Spirit. In 2014, Spirit's bassist Mark Andes represented the band alongside the estate of the late guitarist Randy California, who wrote the song Taurus, and initiated a copyright infringement lawsuit against Zeppelin with the hope of getting proper songwriting credit. For the next 6 years, the case went through California courts as well as the appeals process, and in 2020, a San Francisco appeals court ruled in favor of Led Zeppelin, essentially saying Stairway's intro resembled Spirit's Taurus, but not enough to warrant a full songwriting credit. If any of you out there listen to both songs' intros back to back, I think you'll see that the court got it right. The intros are similar, but they are most definitely not the same. Chris?
Yeah, Led Zeppelin 4 is a special record. We talked about it a few months ago on our 1971 album as part of the second golden age of rock.
Yeah.
And it's just an exceptional record in the sense of it's so varied that you get the lilting ballad of Going to California, you get the unhinged rocker and rock and roll, you get all the Tolkien love in the Battle of Evermore and Misty Mountain Hop, and then you get the pure blues rock of When the Levee Breaks, which is just awesome. So at this point, like you said, they were maturing, and they just had a confidence to them that they could make this kind of sweeping record, and really put together a well thought out, really incredibly well sequenced record that just showed just some real growth and some real depth to what they were doing. It's just exceptional record, and one of my favorites. It was actually, as I said on that episode in 71, I bought 3 albums with my own money on one night. I went out and I got this album, Abbey Road, and Dark Side of the Moon. And those were the first 3 CDs I ever bought with my own money. And so I go back a long way with Led Zeppelin 4. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. And, just really just great stuff. I mean, you go from being just absolutely kick-ass, just bonkers with rock and roll to absolutely gorgeous with the Battle of Evermore, and then even more gorgeous, and then just rocked out with Stairway to Heaven. I mean, you talk about a sequencing job. That's extraordinary right there.
Yeah, it's one of the most perfect albums ever made. And another album that I think is better than Abbey Road. Okay, the next Zeppelin album, Houses of the Holy from 1973. This album comes right smack in the middle of Led Zeppelin's imperial phase in their discography. And Houses of the Holy is quite possibly the band's most wildly eclectic record, encompassing so many styles and genres from one track to another that it's a pretty disorienting listen, albeit a very riveting one. After the massive commercial success the band were having at the time, as well as the sold-out arena tours all over the world, and the fact that critics were finally coming around to praising them, they felt fearless, emboldened, and empowered enough to spread their musical wings as far as they could. Stitched together from different tape recordings of different jam sections, album opener, the song remains the same, sounds like anything but that, in fact. It sounds like, with its various chord progressions and tempo shifts, the rousing overture to a progressive rock opus. This slides seamlessly into the Rain Song, another slow builder that grows into a blossoming crescendo and stands as one of Zeppelin's most sublimely beautiful ballads. Over the Hills and Far Away is your classic and by now probably rote and predictable Zeppelin standard. Starts off like an acoustic folk song before blasting off into typical Zeppelin-esque full electric bombast. Then the album gets freaky. The hard, dirty funk of James Brown is evoked with the crunge. Dancing Days is the band's first foray into pure pop, albeit in heavy-handed Zeppelin style. Jamaica, spelled D''Yer and then MAK''ER, with its title a pun on the word and the country Jamaica, is predictably Zeppelin's foray into reggae, which was just taking off in the mainstream at the time thanks to Bob Marley. Robert Plant loved his J.R.R. Tolkien fantasy books, but he also loved Norse mythology, as evoked in the Immigrant Song and perhaps the album's standout track, a masterpiece of meditative, moody, menacing, dark, almost goth rock ambiance, which is No Quarter. And then, of course, we come back down to earth with The Ocean, with its stabbing, jagged, repetitive guitar riff and one of John Bonham's strangest time signatures, employing septuple meter of all things. As a whole, it's a slight downgrade compared to the heights Led Zeppelin achieved with their first 4 albums, but by God, what heights they achieved. The stylistic excursions are admirable, but probably are one style too far, as I've never really been a fan of Jamaica. Still a wonderful album. Chris?
Yeah, I love this album as a kid. This is for a stretch. This was my favorite album of any kind in probably the summer of 1992. I was huge into this record, and because of the stylistic variation. I mean, it was just an enchanting listen. When you go from Dancing Days into Diarmic or into Jamaica, into No Quarter, and then The Ocean. I mean, just those 4 songs in a row, and just there's a sweep there, and I don't know, it was something, and like especially No Quarter, like I love that electric piano solo by John Paul Jones, and like you said, The Ocean is just weird because like that drumming pattern is just so quirky. And just everything, like even the organ on Dancing Days, there's just one quirk after another that shows up on this record. Like the most normal song on it is Over the Hills and Far Away, and even that is arguably not even that normal. you know, it's something. So yeah, it just listening to this album this week brought me back to when I was a kid.
Right.
And just, made me appreciate it that much more that they were taking, by this point, they were so confident that they were taking chances. Was it as consistent as Led Zeppelin 4? Hell no. I mean, was it as viscerally as exciting as Led Zeppelin 2? Hell no. But it was a damn good record and damn fine songwriting and I think it's one of the albums that like one of our myths is that they weren't a songwriter band. Well, no, you listen to Houses of the Holy. Yeah, man, they were a songwriter band.
Yeah, they were. They were great songwriters.
And this album absolutely proves it.
Right. The next one, my personal favorite, Physical Graffiti from 1975. I've said this over and over again on this podcast and in person with you, Chris, and other people. The biggest bullshit myth in all music, and rock music in particular, is the idea that double albums are bloated, indulgent, full of filler, and should be edited to single albums. Wrong! If you look back on history and the catalogs/discographies of the greatest artists in music or just rock music, you'll find that double albums are, more often than not, either among an artist's best work or it is their best work. I can give you a long list of examples to back this up. But let's stay on Led Zeppelin and their double album opus, Physical Graffiti. The stylistic and genre experiments on Houses of the Holy were interesting, but sometimes uneven. On Physical Graffiti, they perfected their approach to creating a rich, fulfilling tapestry of sounds and styles, running the gamut from blues to folk, to country, to funk, to R&B and soul, to Indian classical, all unified and tethered by the classic Zeppelin stamp, of Jimmy Page's endlessly inventive guitar riffs, John Bonham's virtuoso drumming, and John Paul Jones's genius for string arrangements and multi-instrumentalism. Of the 15 total tracks, 6 are actually outtakes from previous albums, but it's a testament to how unified and cohesive, yet spellbindingly eclectic this double album set is that the older songs fit in seamlessly. Both Custard Pie and The Rover kick off disc 1 with vintage Zeppelin crunch and power, but even these songs are above average and give you the sense that you're in for a special album. Then we have In My Time of Dying, the most intense, relentless, powerfully epic blues jam in the band's entire discography. And yes, it's generally a cover of a Blind Willie Johnson song, and yes, he gets a songwriting credit. Disc 2 is where Zeppelin spread their stylistic wings. Or I should say maybe side 2 of disc 1. The songs Houses of the Holy, obviously an outtake from their previous album, confirms how the band, just like with the song Dancing Days, were becoming increasingly comfortable with straightforward pop rock. Trampled Underfoot, just like with the grunge, with the previous album, shows how effective Zeppelin could be with R&B and soul music. This one a decidedly funky take on the clavinet-heavy funk Stevie Wonder was doing at the time. And with Kashmir, a song that rivals Stairway to Heaven as one of their signature songs, Jones's string and horn arrangements, along with his eerie mellotron, give the track an exotic, rich Indian flavor that is powered along by Bonham's tasteful and subtle rhythm shifts. On In the Light, the soaring psychedelic ballad that starts disc 2, Jones's clavinet and synthesizer dominate again on a song that he mostly wrote himself. Page's folk instrumental Brawn ER then acts as an appropriate segue to the gorgeous Down by the Seaside, a lush, languid country number that is probably Zeppelin's best ever foray into the genre. By this point, Zeppelin's ballads were becoming as good as their full-on rockers, and 10 Years Gone is quite simply one of the greatest, most moving power ballads in rock history. Night Flight is one of the tightest grooves Page and Bonham ever concocted together, while the Wonton song just fucking rips like the heavy rock monster that it is. Boogie with Stew is a delectable piece of lo-fi, gritty New Orleans-style piano-based boogie-woogie, while the rollicking country blues of Black Country Woman harkens back to the folky reveries of Led Zeppelin III. The album closes a bit oddly with Sick Again, a piece of proto-grunge that nearly quotes Pete Townshend's riff for The Who's I'm Free and shows Plant taking a bit of misogynist pity on underage groupies. Whenever a band creates a grand artistic statement, it's called, quote, their Sgt. Pepper's. Well, I really think this is Led Zeppelin's Sgt. Pepper's. And while their objectively best album is probably Led Zeppelin 4, Physical Graffiti is my personal favorite. Chris, I know you're not that big on this record.
No, it's not my personal favorite. I do think that yeah, you're right. In a lot of cases, the double album tends to be an artist's best or one of their best records. This is one of those double albums that could have benefited from being a solo record, from being a single disc. It could have. I just think there's a lot of bloat, especially on disc 2. I mean, in the Light and 10 Years Gone and the Wonton song are all awesome, but I can do without the rest of disc 2. I'm not a huge fan of Down by the Seaside or Night Flight or Boogie with Stew. Black Country Woman is good. But the rest of it is it gets a little long in the tooth, and I think that it gets a little unfocused because of that. And so I think if you'd have taken those 3 songs that I mentioned, In the Light, 10 Years Gone, and the Wonton song, and put them on a disc and had just a good solid 9-track record, then you could have really had something. It would have been perfect. But I think that they did bloat it. They did get a little over excessive, and and just the fact that they were grabbing from their archives to fill out the record. It's like they they wanted enough to have a double record, so they were grabbing stuff from their coffers. And it just kind of shows you that they didn't set out to make a double record, But one of the things was is when they did the 8 songs that they recorded for this record, they had 3 sides, and so they needed to fill it out with more. I just wish there was a way physically that they could have done the 9 song record and done without the rest of it, because it really just kind of drags it down and just kind of it's basically it's like a I don't know, it's like an iron, it's like an anvil putting them into the ocean. I'm
Yeah,
just
I couldn't disagree more. Because I mean, Zeppelin were by this point, like their outtakes were better than most other bands' best stuff. So like it's like early Oasis, right? And the double album for them suits them because it just emptied their coffers, and those coffers needed to be emptied because I there's some amazing songs, man. I love Boogie with Stu. I love Black Country Woman. I think Down by the Seaside is their best stab at country music. Yeah, well, we'll always disagree on that.
yeah, we will always agree to disagree on physical graffiti. I think it's bloated and too long and could have benefited from some economy. And
Yeah.
you think it's perfect.
Yeah. Next, Presence from 1976. Things weren't going well in Led Zeppelin's world during the time of recording Presence. Robert Plant was involved in a severe car accident that resulted in a broken leg, which hindered his full participation when it came to recording vocals and contributing to the songwriting. John Bonham's alcoholism was starting to take its toll on him, making him sometimes undependable for rehearsals, and he was genuinely feeling disillusioned with being on the road all the time and away from his family. Jimmy Page's dabbling with heroin eventually became an all-consuming addiction, and John Paul Jones was getting increasingly sick of the whole Zeppelin scene and showed it by being increasingly distant from the band. Nevertheless, the band managed to cobble together an album before they went on a brief hiatus. Between Plant's injury, Bonham's drunken unreliability, and Jones's indifference, much of the creative force of the record came from Page, which is obvious in how guitar heavy the album is, lacking many of the exotic arrangements and experimental sonic soundscapes of the previous albums. However, despite the presence, no pun intended, of filler tracks like the goofy glam pop of Hot Song for Nowhere and the meandering snooze fest blues ballad T for One, there is some greatness on this record. Achilles' Last Stand, where Plant's mythological lyrical interests go from Norse to Greek, is a prog metal epic with multiple rhythmic changes and musical passages, as well as an array of dazzling Jimmy Page riffs and solos. Unfortunately, Zeppelin go back to their stealing ways with Nobody's Fault But Mine, whose lyrics come from an old 1927 blues song by Blind Willie Johnson called It's Nobody's Fault But Mine, with Johnson not credited. Musically, though, it's pure Led Zeppelin at their most bluesy majestic, with a riveting stop-start dynamic and call-and-response vocals. For Your Life, with Plant's lyrics warning of the dangers of cocaine addiction, is a loose groove jam that in fact came from an improvised in the studio jam session while they were recording the record. Candy Store Rock is good old 1950s rockabilly given the heavy Zeppelin treatment. Overall, a solid, if slightly flawed, 4-star album that is disappointing only when compared to the lofty heights of the previous 6 albums. For any other band, this would be their peak. Chris?
Oh, I agree. I think this album, I actually think it's their most underrated record. I think it's even more underrated than Led Zeppelin 3. I like this record a lot because they're dabbling in some formulas and they're doing some hybrid stuff here. That basically the formula for this album is rockabilly plus James Brown plus cock rock equals presence. Because think about some of these songs like For Your Life is so sensual and so sexy, and Candy Store Rock is so much fun and such a rumbler, and just Achilles' Last Stand is so epic and just like so like just ridiculously proggy, and just everything about this record. And yeah, you're right. T for One goes on a little too long. That's like the one bad mark on the record. It's a nine
I,
and a
I think Hot Song for Nowhere is stupid.
Oh, Hot Tub for Nowhere is okay. It's at least a fun song. I mean, I've always kind of enjoyed the riff on that song, and the riff and the drumming on it is always kind of fun. But T for One, it's a 9.5 minute long song that could have benefited from being 5.5 minutes shorter. I know what they're going for. It's kind of like their take on James Brown. It's a man's world.
Yeah.
In some ways, and they're kind of going for sensual blues, and it doesn't quite work. But the rest of the album is fantastic, and it's a showcase for Jimmy Page, and for obvious reasons, as you said, because he kind of was creatively in the lead on the record
Yeah.
by necessity.
Right.
But yeah, it's a showcase for his playing and his writing and his production, and just really, really good stuff. And I've been a big fan of that record for a long time, and I do think it's more underrated than Led Zeppelin 3. It doesn't get credit for being as good as it is.
All right. Next and the final studio album by Led Zeppelin, In Through the Outdoor from 1979. Zeppelin may have still been the biggest selling band in the world, but things had really gotten worse for them on a personal level. John Bonham had become a bloated, surly, unreliable drunk and a cokehead who pissed off everyone around him. Their manager, Peter Grant, had become a full-blown cocaine addict whose behavior got more and more erratic. John Paul Jones was just a member in name only and only showed up when needed. And Jimmy Page's heroin use had gotten so bad that it had finally started to hamper his creativity. Robert Plant was pretty much the public relations face of the band by this time, and by now he had assumed a leadership role. He and Jones were the guiding forces behind the making of In Through the Outdoor, but with Page at significantly less than 100% physically and creatively, and Bonham a total mess. A Led Zeppelin album with the guitarist and drummer not in top form is going to be an album that lacks, and this album is as lackluster as it gets. Fool in the Rain is a cheesy, misguided attempt by John Paul Jones to approximate Brazilian samba and Caribbean rhythms. Carousel Lombra is an unholy mix of disco and carousel music, given the lengthy progressive rock treatment and dominated by Jones's synthesizers, and it's fucking horrible. On Hot Dog, the band really embarrassed themselves with some seriously corn poke country music, almost a parody, which is really embarrassing considering how well and earnestly they executed country music on previous records. There are two good songs on the album, though. The opener, In the Evening, has the only good guitar riff on the whole record, and it struts along with the stately hard rock grace of the best material from Physical Graffiti. All My Love is a tender, mid-tempo Robert Plant ballad that foreshadows the mellower direction he would go in for his solo career. And for once, Jones's synthesizers aren't smothering the track in a coating of unlistenable cheese. One of our curmudgeonly tenets is that no one is good forever, and Led Zeppelin crashed pretty hard on this, hands down their worst album. It sold like hotcakes, though, because after all, they were Led Zeppelin. They did a massive show at Nebworth in the UK in the summer of 1979, and they did a successful European arena tour in the summer of 1980. They were in the middle of rehearsing for an upcoming US tour when Bonham, after drinking 40 shots of vodka, choked on his vomit while he was sleeping, dying at the age of 32, and basically ending Led Zeppelin as a band. Chris, I believe you have a little more of a positive view on In Through the Outdoor, right?
Yeah, yeah. In a lot of ways, I think that there's some really good pop music. Yeah, is it their worst record? Sure, but I think that between In the Evening and Southman Suarez, which I've always loved, and All My Love and I'm Gonna Crawl and Fool in the Rain. I'm a fan of Fool in the Rain. I think most of the record, yeah, is it a little cheesy? Is it a little poppy? It's good, but it's catchy, it's poppy, it's hooky. There's some really good keyboard stuff going on from Paul Jones. And so Plant and Jones did a really good job of holding down the fort, and they did come up with some good songs. Hot Dog and Carousel Ramba are both terrible. Hot Dog was probably the worst thing they ever did as a band, and Carousel Ramba I mean, just the idea of prog disco. That's all you need to know. Prog disco does not work. It won't work. It should never work, and it should never have been on the album. It's just terrible.
Yeah.
But for the most part, like I said, I'm a fan of it. You know who else was kind of a fan of it though, don't you?
Why, who is that, Chris?
That would be our resident favorite rock critic, Robert Christgau, who gave kind of a funny review of it. He gave it a B plus, but he had a couple of things to say. So this is Christgau on In Through the Outdoor. Quote, the tuneful synthesizer pomp on side two confirms my long held belief that this is a real good art rock band. And their title for the first 10 minutes or so, Carousel Rambra, suggests that they find this as humorous as I do. The Lollapalooza hooks on the first side confirms the world's long held belief that this is a real good hard rock band. Lacks in the lyrics department as usual, but their best since Houses of the Holy. B plus. Yeah, Bob, I think you're a little off in calling it the best since Houses of the Holy. But yeah, it is a tuneful, like you said, tuneful synthesizer pomp is a good way to put it.
Yeah,
You know,
maybe.
I think that really kind of captures it. That in some ways it's an inconsequential record, but it was an inconsequential Zeppelin record, which means it had its merits.
Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose. Or maybe like a firehouse, if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock.
So, drummer John Bonham died in September 1980. That pretty much ended Led Zeppelin as the band. But of course, the other three lived on and they're still alive today. And from 1980 to 2024, a lot has gone on in the world of Led Zeppelin or Led Zeppelin members. Chris?
Yeah, it's an interesting story to see, what they've done, and a lot of the story has to do with Plant trying to kind of carve out his own legacy away from Zeppelin, and Jimmy Page trying to preserve the 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 Zeppelin legacy, through his own collaborations with other artists, and also, getting back with Page or getting back with Plant, excuse me. So let's talk about this a little bit. So, yeah, like we said, Robert Plant did have a successful solo career, and had a bunch of hits, Big Log and In the Mood, and several other songs that we've mentioned. He had a couple of hit albums, especially Now and Zen from 1988. That album became a big hit for him on both sides of the pond. And a lot of what he was doing was very tuneful, very, very ballady, very R&B-ish kind of stuff. And it was not the cock rock of Led Zeppelin at all. So he definitely was carving his own legacy. Now, as far as what Page was doing, in 1984, he shacked up with Paul Rodgers and a band called The Firm, and they had a big hit in Britain called Radioactive, which actually there was a video for it that was in heavy rotation in MTV for a few months, and that became a big hit for them. Well, the appetite for Zeppelin, never quite died, and so you would get frequent reunions that would happen through the years, especially in 1984 or early 1985. Page, Plant, and Jones got back together and they released an album under the name The Honey Drippers. You remember this, Art? Where
Barely remember it.
yeah,
So
they
it
did
basically was Led Zeppelin but with a different name.
yeah, it was basically Zeppelin with a different name, but what they were doing was they were doing covers of 50s torch songs. So they did a cover of the song Sea of Love, which became a big hit in America. And
Right.
and that's what that album was like sort of 50s almost Cole Porterish kind of stuff from
Right.
from early rock and roll and doing that. And then they reunited in Philadelphia for Live Aid, the Live Aid show in August of '85. Trivia question: who was on drums?
Phil Collins, of all people.
Yes, Phil Collins was the drummer. Phil Collins played John Bonham, which
But
is
if
kind
you
of
think about it, it makes sense because before Phil Collins became 80s pop star Phil Collins, he was always a member of Genesis, and Genesis were 80s pop group Genesis. But when Peter Gabriel was in the band, he was the lead singer in the early 1970s. Genesis were a prog rock band that had really complex music, and Phil Collins was an accomplished drummer. So I could see why they would want him there, you know?
yeah. I mean, it made sense. I mean, Collins was actually a good drummer. Like the album Abacab has got some great drumming on it.
Right. Yeah.
From
Yeah.
Collins. So yeah, so he actually was pretty good, but it just kind of cracked me up that Phil Collins of all people, we know Phil Collins as the "You'll Be in My Heart,"
Yeah.
big,
Yeah.
cheesy guy. She seems to have an invisible touch, yeah.
Right.
That guy, but drumming for Led Zeppelin doesn't seem
Yeah.
to make a whole lot of sense. So you had that, and then so Glenn is humming along with his solo career, and then all of a sudden, uh, Page is starting to seemingly want to get back to doing more Zeppelin stuff. He did an album with David Coverdale.
Yeah.
You remember
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Coverdale Page record.
Coverdale Page. Yeah. It wasn't very good.
It wasn't very good at all,
David Cover Plant.
yep, and it kind of showed that Page had some Led Zeppelin leanings, and so it
Yeah.
was inevitable. In 1994, Plant and Page got together, and they toured together, playing a lot of the greatest hits from the Led Zeppelin catalog. They did not invite John Paul Jones to that tour, however, which is a point of consternation. I remember when Zeppelin was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 1995. They're all giving their speeches, and John Paul Jones comes up and says, "I just want to thank my bandmates for finally remembering my phone number." Like, ooh,
Yeah, because
ooh,
they got together
burn.
as Page. They got together as Page and Plant playing Led Zeppelin songs, but not under the name Led Zeppelin.
Yeah, exactly. So they stopped short of a full-fledged reunion
Yeah.
of Led Zeppelin. So they did that, and then so Page and Plant worked together a lot for the rest of the '90s, doing their touring, and I think they actually did an album together of
Well, they
original.
did two. The live album from '94. That's them doing. It was done for MTV. It was them doing Zeppelin songs with
Right.
like Indian and Moroccan traditional music arrangements, and then an album of original songs.
Yes, they did the album of original songs, which was not very good.
Yeah.
I remember it actually was kind of a stinker. And so they get into the 2000s, and uh, Plant goes his own way again, and he actually scores a pretty big hit with the bluegrass singer Alison Krauss,
Yeah.
and they get together with T-Bone Burnett, and now they're doing covers of the Everly Brothers and other 50s bands, doing
Mhm.
this kind of swamp rock arrangements, and like doing a cover of Gone Gone Gone
Mm.
by the Everly Brothers, and really knocking it out of the park. The Plant's voice and Krause's voice went together beautifully,
Yeah.
and with Burnett's arrangements and guitar playing, it's just a really, really strong album. And it actually ended up winning the Grammy for Album of the Year.
Yeah.
in 2008.
Right.
So which was good stuff. And then there was a tribute show to to record executive Atlantic Records executive Ahmet Ertegun in 2007, in which Jones, Plant, and Page all played together, and Page and Jones were wanting to do a Led Zeppelin reunion tour. Plant refused it, sticking to his integrity of not wanting to revisit the past,
Yeah.
and kind of gave up on that.
And
So
the Alison Krauss collaboration was an excuse for him,
yeah,
because
well,
it was successful.
a really damn good excuse. Why would he want to abort that when it was making money?
Yeah.
And it was a big hit. I think it went a couple times platinum,
Yeah. It
actually.
was a very successful record. Yeah.
Yeah. So why would you want to abandon that? So yeah, he made the right decision there. But yeah, but it ultimately they dabbled with each other. They did some work with each other here and there. They would have their reunions, but they never had a full blown let's make new Led Zeppelin music. Let's go on a new Led Zeppelin tour. They never quite got that together. And a lot of that has to do with Robert Plant's feelings.
Yeah.
I would think, again, we've kind of established that in this episode. So those are really the highlights of what has happened since 1980, since Bonham's death.
Yeah.
Which is really tragic because, what do you think Zeppelin would have become in the 80s had they kept going? Would we have gotten more of an into the outdoor, or would they have found a way to restore themselves?
It would have sounded like a hybrid of solo Robert Plant and The Firm.
Yeah,
Heavy
probably.
on the ballads, heavy on the ballads.
Yeah, yeah, heavy on the ballads and heavy on the reverb.
Yeah.
The
Yeah,
eight
that's
the
what it
eight
would have
the
been.
80s reverb.
Yeah. you know.
Yeah.
And then as we go on, and I talked about this already in the parameter setter, like Led Zeppelin's influence has just gotten greater and greater and greater as the decades have gone on, to the part that, the band that is called the greatest rock band of all time is generally known as the Beatles, right?
Yep.
Led Zeppelin may be the only band that can challenge them for that title.
I
You
think
know,
that's a fair statement, either them or the
as,
Who.
or the Who. No, but as far as like greatest and most influential, you can argue Zeppelin are about as influential as the Beatles.
Oh,
You think
they
about
might
it.
be more influential than the Beatles.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. What they did in late 60s, early 70s, heavy metal became a thing in the 1970s because of Led Zeppelin. Black Sabbath wouldn't have been signed to a record label if it weren't for Led Zeppelin,
Yep.
And then later on, what heavy metal became in the late 70s, the stuff that AC/DC and Van Halen did, and Motorhead and Rush.
Judas
Led
Priest.
Zeppelin, Judas Priest, Led Zeppelin's stamp is all over that. Without Led Zeppelin, we don't get Rush. We don't get Van Halen. And Eddie Van Halen himself even admitted it. We don't get Judas Priest. We don't get AC/DC without Led Zeppelin. Okay. Forward into the 1980s, what we had in the 1980s, a lot of the heavy alternative rock of the 1980s, as punk was becoming post-punk, becoming indie and alternative rock. A lot of Jane's Addiction. We don't get
Yeah.
Jane's Addiction without Led Zeppelin. Okay.
Nope.
We don't get Guns N' Roses without Led Zeppelin.
Yeah,
Oh,
you don't get the Cult.
you don't get the Cult without Led Zeppelin. Oh, another band I forgot to mention, Aerosmith. You don't get Aerosmith without Led Zeppelin.
Oh, no shit. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 70s hard rock, Led Zeppelin gave birth to, like I said, bands like Van Halen, Aerosmith, Judas Priest, Rush even, okay? Forward into the 1990s. Without Led Zeppelin, you don't get grunge. Okay.
Nope.
I mean, no Soundgarden, no Alice in Chains. Well, you can argue Alice in Chains are more heavily influenced by Black Sabbath, but they were also influenced by Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
Soundgarden, obviously Led Zeppelin.
STP.
Nirvana, Stone Temple Pilots, huge influence by Led Zeppelin. Nirvana, Kurt Cobain himself even admitted he was a Led Zeppelin fan. Led Zeppelin 2 was one of his all-time favorite records that he had written down. And there's a Nirvana song, a very old Nirvana song, an old outtake from the early days. You can find it on the Incesticide compilation. Okay, the name of the song is Aero Zeppelin.
Yep.
You could tell where Kurt
Gee.
Cobain, where his tongue in cheek was going with that song title.
Yeah, no shit.
So you
Yep.
get that. You can hear Zeppelin's influence on the electronic industrial rock of Nine Inch Nails, the heaviness of Nine Inch Nails. You can hear Zeppelin's influence in there. You can hear Zeppelin's influence in the stoner rock of the late 90s and early noughties. Hello, Queens of the Stone Age. I mean, it
Yep.
wasn't just Black Sabbath that influenced Josh Homme. It was Led Zeppelin as well. You can hear Led Zeppelin in the dirty, bluesy garage rock of the White Stripes. What the hell are the White Stripes if not small scale punk Zeppelin? Okay.
Yep.
It keeps going on. Even Noel Gallagher admitted that Led Zeppelin was an influence on Oasis and the
Oh,
heavy
obviously.
sound on the heavy sound of the album Be Here Now and the stuff they did later on in the noughties. Led Zeppelin influenced them there. Led Zeppelin were also a big influence later on in the 2010s with really shitty bands like Greta Van Fleet, who
Yep.
was basically a Zeppelin parody act.
Yep.
Okay. So even to this day, you can hear the influence of Led Zeppelin all over, even though rock music now is no longer a mainstream pop cultural force. Led Zeppelin is still
Yeah.
touching that. Led
Well,
Zeppelin is
well,
still,
like even these teenage girls like Olivia Rodriguez that are trying to be like rocker girls,
yeah.
they're really kind of taking their cues from Zeppelin.
Yeah. Although she would say, I guess in her defense, she would say she's trying to be more punk, but I don't really listen to Olivia Rodrigo. I've only heard a few songs and I think she's terrible. But anyway, but back to
Yeah.
Led Zeppelin's influence on rock. It's arguably you can I'm not going to say it's bigger than the Beatles, but you can make the argument, and they're the only band for whom you can make that argument, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think that just in terms of their bigness, in terms of their influence, in terms of their sweep,
Yeah.
in terms of what they did, in terms of how they accomplished it, in terms of the iconography, like Plant Scream on Whole Lotta Love.
Yeah.
I mean
Yeah.
that's just iconic as it gets, and
Yeah.
that's as iconic as anything as of any sort of crooning by Lennon or like
Yeah.
like like Paul McCartney's vocals on Hey Jude
Right.
or Lennon's vocals on Please Please Me. I think
Yeah.
it's even more iconic. Uh,
Probably. Yeah.
yeah, Zeppelin's Whole Lot of Love.
Yeah.
It just you're right. I mean, I think they're right there, and they compete ably with the Beatles
Yeah. Yeah.
and with the Who. I think
Yeah.
the Who belongs in that discussion too,
Sure. I agree. Yeah.
as far as iconic bands. But Zeppelin's right there, and they deserve their flowers, and absolutely deserve their flowers, no question.
Right. And that's why we call this episode The Legacy of All Legacies. Chris, so what's your five best phony Zeppelin acts?
Okay, so real quick, phony Zeppelin is kind of its own genre, and there's a few bands that are just great at it. Billy Squire, remember
Oh
Billy
yeah.
Squire? I mean, Billy Squire,
Stroke me,
yeah,
stroke. I wonder what that song's about.
yeah, I have no idea. But Billy Squire, like in 1980 and 81, made a veritable career, and he had a whole bunch of hit singles in a row that basically took the Robert Plant screaming and the huge drums of the Bonham thing, and
Yeah.
to take the huge drums and take the screaming, and that's it, and you can get a whole bunch of great singles out of it. Lonely is the Night, In
Yeah.
the Dark, My Kind of Lover, which sounds exactly like Zeppelin, The
Mhm.
Stroke, The Big Beat, which I love, and is probably his best song. Everybody Wants You is actually the one that probably most resembles Zeppelin. But so Billy Squire, he was a New York guy, and he had been toiling for years, and he finally came across this formula that aped the best parts of Zeppelin, and he became kind of a multi-hit wonder. He wasn't a one-hit wonder. He actually had sustained success for 2 years,
Yeah.
and just really great phony Zeppelin guy. Next band would be Heart.
Yeah.
The the
female Zeppelin.
Yeah, the singles soundtrack, the soundtrack to the movie Singles, it has a cover of the Battle of Evermore in which Ann Wilson sings vocals. Here's a hint. She does not play the Sandy's Denny role. She plays Plant.
Yeah.
So this is female Robert Plant.
Yeah.
And going back to songs like Barracuda, Barracuda is basically a poppier version of Achilles' Last Stand. I mean, it is like the most perfect facsimile of that mid-70s Zeppelin thing. And even songs like Magic Man have the mystique of a Zeppelin. Yeah, almost kind of this exoticness that Zeppelin was capable of, and sensuality. So there's heart. Okay, the next band, The Cult. The Cult was an LA band from the 80s that had the bombast, and they had the cult of personality. They had the swaggering frontman in Ian Astbury, who could match Zeppelin and could match Robert Plant in the pipes department. And they just had rock and roll swagger and bombast and spades, and they could just ape the Zeppelin thing as well as anybody. And then the next two bands seem pretty obvious, and you've already mentioned them. Queens of the Stone Age.
Yeah.
I mean, basically take the first disc of Physical Graffiti and then up those tempos and accentuate those grooves, and you basically get the best of Queens of the Stone Age.
Yeah.
Especially their first four records. Those first four records track the energy and innovation of Zeppelin. Songs like The Lost Art of Keeping a Secret, and just Leg of Lamb, and just some of the stuff like Songs for the Dead. First it taketh, then it giveth away. Some of those songs, it just awesome energy, awesome focus, awesome swagger, and just drama. And not only that, but the sensuality. Zeppelin was one of the most sensual bands of all time.
Right.
Like their stuff was.
Like I said, they were in touch with their feminine side, much more so than any other big cock rock band.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the sensuality, the Queens of the Stone Age take that. There's just a depth and just a real hypnosis to the best of the stuff that Queens of the Stone Age had that they kind of grabbed from Zeppelin. And finally, and the most obviously one is the White Stripes.
Yeah.
That the whole concept of the Stripes, at least originally to me musically, was what if Led Zeppelin consisted of just Jimmy Page and John Bonham,
and stick them in a garage with low production value.
Yeah, exactly. Just bash the fuck out with just the guitarist and just the drums.
Yeah.
And and get that bigness and get that fat assness and just awesomeness. And they really, really captured that in spades. And they were just the embodiment of that blues swagger that that Plant and Bonham, or Page and Bonham, really personified. And then and so that's it, really. I mean, so those five acts: Billy Squier, Heart, The Cult, Queens of the Stone Age, and the White Stripes. Those are the five best phony Zeppelin acts of all time, in my opinion.
And then there's comedy Zeppelin with bands like Dread Zeppelin from the late 1980s, early 90s. They were a Led Zeppelin covers band that did Led Zeppelin songs in reggae with an Elvis Presley impersonator as the lead singer.
Yep. Yeah, gotta love it. Yeah, one of the funnier bands of that era. I remember them. I was a fan of those guys. Great concept. So they lend themselves to some goofiness too. I would have said Whitesnake, but Cover Plant was just desperate to. He was just too much of an attention getter and too desperate, and he just was low rent. He was low rent District Robert Plant.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, he was okay in Deep Purple for a little while. He replaced.
He wasn't completely insufferable then, and then he went Whitesnake, and then went in the shitter. So there you go. Like I said, Billy Squier, Heart, The Cult, Queens of the Stone Age, and White Stripes. Go check them out and rate them for their phony Zeppelinness, which brings us to the end of our episode. As we usually do at the end of these episodes, we encourage you to join our Curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. We've been posting a lot of 1976 stuff up there. And
Led Zeppelin stuff.
And we've been posting a lot of Led Zeppelin stuff. We've actually posted some of that Royal Albert Hall show from 1970 that I mentioned before. Art put up a little bit of a segment of that show. And so, good stuff up there. You'll learn a lot if you come in. We do a good job of putting content up there that's interesting and encouraging. And so please join. It's invite only, but chances are we will let you in. Again, we'd like to hear your thoughts on not just Phony Zeppelin, but our take on Zeppelin. If you think that they are indeed the legacy of all legacies, and especially want to hear if you actually think Led Zeppelin 2 is better than Abbey Road. I don't. Arturo does. What say you? Let us know at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And finally, we're going to put together a playlist, a Spotify playlist to share with y'all. Check the episode description for a link to that special playlist. Essentially, I'm going to dump all 8 studio albums in there.
Yeah.
So all 8 studio albums are going to be in there. That's going to be the playlist, so you can access that. That we've been doing that all year, and that's been a really great value add for all of you. We care about your sonic needs, and we're filling them, damn it.